Let's take it back to 1982. North Carolina has Michael Jordan and Dean Smith. Jordan has the shot. Woody Durham yells his iconic, "Thrown away to Worthy," and the Tar Heels win the NCAA championship.
But Jordan found an opening in the Georgetown zone. It wasn't a big opening, but it was enough. This shot and a Fred Brown turnover made North Carolina 63-62 winners.
I don't think I'm a better coach now because we won a national if we'd lost. I think I'd been the same coach. I really believe that.
I thought about this all the way on the bus. I never thought it'd come true. I just thought in my mind that what if I had to take the last second shot and win or lose, and it happened. And when Coach told me, I just felt my chance came, and I just had to keep my concentration, do the best I could.
And finally, after years of frustration, North Carolina has won in the finals. In New Orleans, Bob Holliday, Action Sports 5.
Then the following year in 1983, Jim Valvano and NC State become legends of March Madness.
In all the years that I've been at WRAL, this state basketball team may be the most fascinating sports story of all. It's about a team that was not supposed to win the championship. It was about a team that was counted out so many times, yet never gave up. There was bedlam in Albuquerque as the pit went berserk, but it was nothing compared to the celebration that broke out on the state campus. It was New Year's Eve and the Mardi Gras all wrapped up into one. It was a celebration of happiness, a celebration to honor a team that had captured the hearts of so many people. The 1983 NCAA basketball champions, the North Carolina State Wolfpack, unbelievable. Hail to the champions. No one deserved it more.
Can you imagine what it would have been like on sports talk radio back then? Wait, was there even sports talk radio back then? Yes, but not like you know it today.
A brief history of Triangle Sports, sponsored by Copiers Plus, your local office equipment and solutions provider. Take the mystery out of your printing expenses by scheduling your free print audit today at copiers-plus.com.
You'll know the voice when you hear it, especially if you hang out at Durham Bulls games. He's Tony Riggsbee, but long before he was the public address announcer at the DBAP, Riggsbee spent decades in radio. I had the pleasure of working with Tony a handful of years on 850 The Buzz, which is where I got my start in sports talk radio. Riggsbee is one of the last connections to what was broadcast media and what is broadcast media today. January 9th, 1972 is your first official day as a radio person, right?
That's right. My first day on air at the old WPTF-FM, which at that point it was a classical music station, which is now WQDR FM. And I still remember my first words on the air. It was simply a station break. You're listening to WPTF-FM. Coming up next, Dutch Concert Hall. So my introduction to radio was doing classical music, and I still say I'm probably one of the few people who's done both classical and country. And I've done very little music radio over my years, very little, but right there at the beginning.
So you're 18.
I'm 18 years old.
How did you you've always had this voice, okay? You've always had the Tony Riggsbee voice. This is what, you're the PA announcer at the Bulls and things like that. So who told you, hey, you should try this?
One of my high school English teachers loved the way I narrated things. Okay. She told me, have you ever considered going into broadcasting? And my initial plan, and I actually did go to law school for a while, I didn't pursue it to the end, was to go into law. But I was always intrigued by radio and by TV. And so put that plug in my ear. So I started calling around to some people and got turned down by a whole lot of people.
That's familiar.
Trying to get the job. And there were a lot more stations then, too, little stations that you could get a start at. But finally, somehow, a guy named John Todd, who was the program manager for PTF-FM at that time, I went in and did an audition. And it was the old-fashioned audition where they would hand you the breaking news in the middle of it and that sort of thing. So somehow I passed, and he gave me a job, and I've been doing it ever since.
Okay, all right. Now, sports talk didn't exist in 1972, did it?
No, it actually started later that year.
Okay.
in the fall of '72, Bill Jackson, who was the play-by-play man for NC State, who was also he had also just been promoted to program director at WPTF, and he had the idea that he wanted to try some sports talk. There was a program on PTF called Kaleidoscope that Bart Rittner hosted. It was sort of a magazine-type show, ran from 6:30 to 8 o'clock every night. And Jackson's idea was that why don't we try a couple of nights a week taking a part of that and making it into a talk show. And originally it was a general interest talk show from 7 to 8. And Bart Rittner was the host of that, the late Bart Rittner. And they did that for about 6 months. And then they decided, well, why don't we take a couple of those nights and see if a sports talk show would work, because this was right at the start of the '72 ACC football season.
Okay.
And those were high times for NC State. Lou Holtz had just arrived from William and Mary. And so they established a program called Sportsline. It was on initially Monday and Friday nights as Sportsline. Bill Jackson was the host, along with Dick Herbert, who had just retired as the News and Observer sports editor and was working part-time as the executive secretary of the American Football Coaches Association. And he got that job because Bill Murray, the old Duke football coach, was the president of that group.
Okay.
But he wanted something else to do, and so they did that, Jackson and Herbert, on Monday and Friday nights. And on Wednesday night, they had something called Wolfpack Sportsline that Lou Holtz did with Wally Osley.
Okay.
And then it turned into the Norm Sloan show.
So this is the genesis of a coach's show.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
And it wasn't the first coach's show, but it was the first one that had any callers calling in. The others had all been pre-taped short-form coach's shows. I remember I even did one after that when I was over at WTIK full-time with Mike McGee every week, but it wasn't a talk show.
Was it cordial when people were calling in to Lou Holtz and Norm Sloan?
It was always cordial to Lou Holtz because he was the new guy in town, had just arrived. Not always so with Norm Sloan. And, of course, Norm Sloan had somewhat of a combative personality anyway. So it was a little bit different. But those programs were successful. But, Joe, back in those days, they were very, very caller-driven.
Yeah.
You didn't have the format we have today for most of your shows.
So did the host? So when you were doing this is did you have opinions, or was it more you were reporting on these shows what had happened during the week or looking ahead to the weekend's matchups?
Well, we had opinions too.
Okay,
they did allow us to have opinions, and of course the callers had a lot of opinions.
Well, of course.
And the problem was when it was so caller driven that. As you know, callers don't necessarily represent the listeners.
It's a very motivated group to call in.
Exactly, and they tend to want to monopolize it and become regular callers and want to be people that are known as a regular caller. And that's always been true in any kind of talk radio, and I think that's one reason why caller-driven talk shows are not as big as they used to be.
So I'm guessing when Norm Sloan was doing his coach's show for NC State, State fans would call in with opinions as to who should be starting, what the rotation should be, why didn't you call a timeout, that kind of stuff?
That kind of thing. And then, too, there was always the stuff that you would have people with Carolina and Duke, primarily Carolina, who hated Carolina, would call in, and say Chapel Hill College and things like that. There was one caller in particular who did that for years and years and years. There wasn't as much animosity toward Duke for the State fans back in those days. But, it's interesting when you look at it, though. There was more animosity toward Duke after 1980 when Mike Krzyzewski arrived than there was in the 1970s. Because you're looking back at the Bill Foster years and the Neil McGahee 1 year there, that sort of thing. So Duke basketball was not the Duke basketball of today. And of course, State was coming off the 1970, headed toward the 1974 national championship and the great seasons under Norm Sloan.
So how did you cover that? So you're, at this point, 21?
Yeah, I was there in 72.
Okay.
Then I was away from 74 to 78. I came back in 78 full-time. I'd gone over to WTIK full-time.
And what was WTIK at that time?
At that point, it was a country station, but I was the news and sports director.
Okay.
So I did all the news and sports shows, and we did a lot of stuff with Duke, although we weren't carrying play-by-play for anyone at that point because WDNC had Duke, PTF had NC State, and WCHL had Carolina.
Yeah.
And at one point in there, 101 FM picked up Carolina too for a while too.
Okay, so during that time in the 70s, you're not as immersed in NC State,
right? As I was in the I was. It was interesting. I was there with NC State in the early 70s and the late 70s, but not in the middle
during
70s.
that peak time,
right? Exactly.
when they won a championship. So and you know it's and the reason why I ask this is because for a lot of the younger demographic. And I guess I include myself in that because I'm 42 as of this recording. I'm 42, so you're
still young, Joe.
I know, Tony. I know. You know, I came into this with it already established with my time at NC State between 1997 and 2001 as State coming out of the Les Robinson years.
Right.
Okay. And
you had missed the controversy of the late Valvano.
Oh yeah,
years.
no, I had to learn all of that. I had to. Learn
that was a huge thing.
Oh, I know. We'll get to that. Yeah. We'll get to that. So I missed out on all that. So for me to learn, you know, through work and interest and everything else, I'm like, oh, okay, this is why NC State fans are the way NC State fans are, or an older demographic of NC State fans are the way they are, because for them, this is what they were used to. This is what they were accustomed to. This is why Roy Williams has such begrudging respect from NC State fans, because he is that last connective tissue to how it used to be, and he absolutely wants to beat State all the time. As he said, I'd rather not eat than lose to NC State. So you're coming up and all that stuff. Duke at this point is just kind of like an afterthought.
Right, pretty much. Duke had in the 1960s a lot of really great teams. They had gone to Final Fours in the early 1960s, but in the Foster years, they were good teams. Mm-hmm. They were very good teams. You had Gene Banks and people like that, but they weren't what they became later after Krzyzewski came in 1980.
Doing radio in the 70s and the 80s, and this is peak ACC time. But you're a baseball guy.
Oh, definitely.
You've always been a baseball guy. So
That's never been a secret.
I know. But what's interesting is that you're immersed in all of this, yet you never lost your love of baseball.
No.
You've always been pursuing baseball.
As a matter of fact, when I came back to WPTF full-time in 1978, Gary Dornberg was the host of Sportsline at that point, and I was his primary fill-in, but then wanting more time off in the summertime, he always called everybody babe. He said, "Hey, babe, why don't you just do some baseball shows in the summertime?"
Boy, you're like, of course.
So I did that, and then it evolved, and I continued as his primary fill-in the rest of the year, and then eventually the point came, and I'm not sure which year, where they decided that he would be the host 3 nights a week and I'd be the host 2 nights a week on Sportsline, and sort of delved into that. And then I was also covering sport. I was the assistant sports director, and then he died and I became the sports director and did the show every night after that. So it was an evolution over the years.
Okay. And as you come back to covering this more, and being more on the NC State side because of WPTF and things like that. Well, you missed 1974. You were there for 1983.
Yes.
So and
I knew Jim Valvano very well.
And you actually did play-by-play a little bit for that NC State team.
I did. I filled in on the Wolfpack Network because PTF was originating the network at that point.
Okay.
And later we partnered with Capital, and it became the Wolfpack Capital Sports Network for a lot of years. But in 83, I can always say I was there doing play-by-play on the first of the wins to end that season, which we all know how that season ended.
Of course.
And the ironic thing was the night of the national championship game, my fellow reporter at PTF, still to this day, Mike Raley, and I were assigned to go to the NC State campus, and we were down on the Brickyard to cover the reaction.
Yeah.
And of course, we didn't know whether it was going to be a
So you're
loss.
sitting there. I'm assuming you're sitting there in a vehicle listening to the radio call.
We were right outside the D.H. Hill Library listening to the radio call.
Okay.
And then it erupts, and suddenly we see couches on fire and things like that. So Rayleigh and I decided, well, we better get back to the news vehicle. We were right behind a WBTV van that had come down from Charlotte. And then the students, shall we say, had become more lubricated at that point. Yeah. And we were in there, and suddenly we're being rocked by just massive. And it was the first time I'd ever seen mob psychology.
What, what did the kids want? Did they want the car? Did they want to tip the car?
I think they wanted the car. And I'm on the two-way radio doing a report. Rayleigh is driving. And then I see Rayleigh just doing this wrap it up thing, and then suddenly there was a guy standing outside. My window was down.
Yeah.
And what he was doing was telling me, get the window up. There was a guy out there who wanted to urinate into the car because the guy was so wasted out there. So we survived that, and we somehow got off campus. The WBTV van and our WPTF station wagon, we got off the campus and pulled over to, at that point on Hillsborough Street, it's been a lot of things over the years, but there was a Roy Rogers roast beef over there. We pulled over into that parking lot and did our reports from there from that point on that night.
So when you're reporting, now when we associate a national championship, Carolina wins in 2017 or Duke wins in 2015, I can go on and on and on. It's all visual now.
Right.
It's all visual. I know with WREL, they want to make sure that they got the static cam on Franklin Street. They're going to send people out there for man-on-the-street interviews and get the visuals of everybody yelling and screaming. So in 1983, obviously, as you mentioned, there's TV aspect of this, but people are still consuming radio at that time as like a main news medium, not something for opinions, not something for entertainment. It's a main news medium for a lot of people. So what were you trying to convey? How did you capture
We
that
were trying
in
to paint the scene that we were basically doing play-by-play on the on the crowd as to what we were seeing. But discretion being the better part of valor, we decided we better get out of there too because we were in a little bit of danger, or so we thought. At the time, but it was amazing, and much more so than, even though I wasn't there on the scene in 1974. The things I've read about the '74 championship was not nearly as wild, but the huge difference, Joe, was 1974. It was not unexpected that NC State would be the national champion. 1983 was extremely unexpected.
Well, I mean, there's a reason why there's an ESPN 30 for 30 about it. And a lot of people associate Jim Valvano running around and winning the national championship as the actual born date of March Madness. But the year before that, Carolina wins the national championship in 1982. So, I mean, I'm assuming as a news station, you still covered that as well.
Yeah, we did.
So obviously with WPTF at that time and being the flagship for and originating the broadcast, there's going to be a different level of coverage.
Right.
Totally understand that. But in 1982, how did it differ for you?
Well, in 82, the fact that we were the NC State Wolfpack affiliate or flagship, we covered it more intensely. But we did have people in Chapel Hill the night in 82 for that championship. I was not assigned to that.
Okay.
But we did have people over there for it that night. But talking to, one of them was he was no longer with us, passed away, but I remember talking to him and he was talking about it was so mild compared to what we experienced on the state campus that year. He had been on Franklin Street doing live reports that night.
Yeah, nobody was trying to relieve themselves in a
right,
news vehicle.
Exactly.
Okay, that's
the first time that story's been told on the air. Rayleigh and I have retold it many, many times over the years.
Well, it's funny, dynamics and what is acceptable now on the air is a little bit different.
Very different.
How it was on the air. You're welcome, I guess. I guess I'm part of what's acceptable now. But anyway, and I was curious. That's why I was curious about 1982. Because, I mean, look, it's viewed as one of the great teams. Jordan was on that team and everything else. But, yeah, there is an inherent difference in the way 1983 was received because that team wasn't supposed to do it. And, you also have the caricature that is Jim Valvano, which I wanted to get back to. You were friends with Valvano.
I was friends with Valvano, although it became a little strained later, not in 82. But when the scandals broke out in later years.
For context here, you've got this book,
right?
Which was
Peter Golenbach.
Peter Golenbach. I actually have a copy of the book in my cubicle, part of my tchotchke collection. And the book, I read the book. It's a terrible book. It's like
it's
got
one
typos.
Of the worst edited books I've ever seen. Yeah.
For those who've never read the book, people will hear personal fouls. They'll hear the name of the book. They'll hear this name, Peter Golenbach, and everything else. And you're right. It was a big scandal. But it's a terrible book. And by today's standard, it would be picked apart with social media and everything else. So let's kind of get to the straining of that relationship and why that was covered the way it was covered. Now when you've got a scandal on campus, there's almost a defense of a school against the NCAA and the NCAA not knowing what the hell it's doing. But back in the 80s, that wasn't the case. This was a big deal, and even NC State as an institution went above and beyond what you would expect an institution to do over a sports program now. So, let's kind of walk it back from the beginning there and when things started to get strained with Valvano, the school, and the media.
Well, part of it, too, you have to go back to the fact that at that point, Valvano had also become the athletic director, which is a huge part of this. And when the book came out and the accusations about the various things, and the assistant coach Tommy Abatamarco and Chris Washburn and all of that, and
tickets and shoes.
Yeah, exactly. And I had on our talk shows, Dornberg was very much pro Valvano through the thing. I had taken the stance that this is a conflict of interest. Valvano should not be the athletic director. I have no problem with him being the basketball coach, but there needs to be another athletic director in this situation.
Yeah.
So it became somewhat strained. And so Valvano calls me one day and says, come over to my office. I want to talk about this. And he basically says, what have you got against me? And I said, Coach, I got nothing against you. I love you personally. I just think that in this situation, there should be a different athletic director overseeing the program.
Yeah.
And you know what Valvano said? He said, that's fair enough. I got no problems with that. and he said, we still buddies, or we paisans, or something like that. And so we were always fine after that. But people who were Valvano fans never forgave me for that. And I had, not death threats, but people calling and saying, we're going to get you, that sort of thing. I never believed any of it, but it was the passions of the time. But
with this when people were calling in live?
No, well, they were calling live, saying nasty things to me. But I would get a letter or something like that.
Yes.
This was pre-email.
Now we get tweets from some guy with a Wolfpack fan 84 or whatever it is, and some anonymous user. You're getting letters.
But the thing about it was that my relationship with Valvano was always fine from that point on. And one of my last memories of Valvano, when he was dying, but he was still doing some games for ABC, and I was covering a game at Joel Coliseum in Winston-Salem that he was doing TV for, and ran into him in the men's room, and we had a long conversation that night. And he, give me a hug, that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
there was never anything personal on it, but you couldn't tell fans,
Of course,
that. And I have never believed that coaches should be ADs at the same time, and that solidified that with me, that it's not a good thing.
Now, you were able to build this relationship with Valvano, but you also were able to build relationships with other coaches too. So at what point, again, this is an era of sports coverage that I am not familiar with. When I first started doing this full time in 2002, there had already been a wall that had started to go up between the universities and the people that covered them. But when I've talked to you, you and I have done radio, which we'll get to in a second, or talking to the late Colton Tudor or other old columnists who are still with us, like an Ed Harden, Frank DeCenzo, wherever he is, would always tell me about
wherever he is, he's the best dressed person there.
Yes, it's true. This is true. I got to find Frank. So, Frank would tell me, oh, yeah, you'd finish covering a game at Cameron Indoor Stadium. You would go to Devines, and the coach would be there, or the coaching staff
or
would be
NC
there.
State Emedios.
Yes. That doesn't exist now.
Right.
So when did you start to see, or what do you think is like one of the inflection points of when that started to happen, where the relationship between the people who covered the coaches and the coaches back it started to get a little icier or more professional?
I would say the late 80s, early 90s was sort of a turning point on that. After some of the situations like the controversy with Valvano, those were contributing things. But also I think that a lot of the younger coaches and the younger media members were not as interested in it, younger at that point.
Yeah, at that point. Right.
As it had been in the past. And at that point, too, you got to remember that media members would travel with the teams on team buses.
Camaraderie gets built.
Yeah, because you had that relationship because you were dealing with each other every day.
Yeah,
and
Tudor
became
would talk.
friends.
I think Tudor had mentioned to me that like Dean Smith would bum cigarettes from him.
Oh, yeah, I can believe that because Smith used to smoke during his post-game press conferences at the old Carmichael Auditorium, where the press conference was on some stairs, actually, after the games, before the Smith Center was built. Yeah, that was not uncommon at all. And some coaches more so than others. Now, one of the early coaches that I covered, Mike McGee at Duke, football coach, who later was the AD at Southern Cal and at South Carolina, he was more formal. He wasn't really interested in being buddy-buddy with, but a lot of coaches were. Lou Holtz never was as buddy-buddy with media members as some of the others had been.
Okay.
But then once you got back to a Dick Sheridan, people like that, and I shouldn't say it's because he's Southern, but he was.
Okay.
I think that played into it a little bit, too, that Dick Sheridan like to have those relationships.
Different regional dynamics might come into play on that one. So we get through the 80s, and you're still doing at this point. WFAN has come online in New York, and WFAN is what many people view as the template for what you get from sports talk today.
Right.
Even though there were versions of sports talk before WFAN became what people identify as sports talk.
There weren't as many full-time sports talk stations.
So in the 80s and in the early 90s, Sportsline has become this daily show, right?
Right.
Okay.
And first 2 hours a night, and then for a while 3 hours a night.
Was it mainly college at that point? I mean, were you talking Washington Redskins?
Yes.
Okay.
Because and we may have done it more than other stations because we carried Redskins games with Sonny, Frank, and Sam.
Yeah.
And so we had a lot of Redskin talk. And we also carried the Yankees in the summer at that point, and we had a lot of Yankee talk. And then the other dynamic that built in year-round was recruiting, which became huge. And that started in the mid-'70s. I remember there was a publication then called The Poop Sheet.
Oh yes,
and
yes. That's for folks
yeah.
listening. This is the first episode of this podcast series. We will talk to David Glenn about the Poop Sheet and the evolution of recruiting in a future episode.
Yeah, and the recruiting experts, Bob Gibbons, Rick Ettinger, Hewlin Pickett, all of those guys would come on a very regular basis, and they were always packed. I mean, it was one call right after another.
People wanted the latest scoop on what a particular recruit was.
Yeah,
what were
exactly.
they leaning towards?
Or sometimes they would go, well, so and so in the 9th grade, and
they wanted to know.
It would get to the point of absurdity at times.
Now, this is before message boards, message boards were where you would get a lot of rumors and accusations of things that were not on the up and up. Would you get calls during that time about, if you were talking to a recruiting expert, how much of that was, where's this player leaning, and how much of that was, well, I heard that David Thompson, ... Like, what was that?
You would get some of that.
Yeah.
It was not the majority.
Okay.
In terms of callers, most of it was, well, where do you think so-and-so is going? And I remember, for some reason, Curtis Hunter, I think he had more conversation about him in his high school days than anybody I can remember. Where is Curtis Hunter going? It seemed like it went on for years and years and years and years. And it was interesting, too, the dynamic in the callers who were interested in basketball recruiting.
Mm-hmm.
It was more passionate than those who were interested in football recruiting.
That would make sense.
Yeah, we would have the football recruiting shows, and those fans would be very knowledgeable, but they didn't seem to be living with it to the extent of basketball.
You could see these high school basketball players.
Yes.
If you wanted to. You
Right.
could see them at a state tournament. You could, any number of reasons you could have a better understanding.
Holiday tournament here in Raleigh, that was one of it was, manna from heaven for recruiting fans. And, they would pack at different times, Reynolds Coliseum, sometimes Dorton Arena, sometimes it was at Holiday Gym at Broughton, but they would pack it every year.
So we get to the 90s, and I believe in 1995, 850 The Buzz signs on. But in 1995, 850 The Buzz was Hot Talk. I had moved here in 1995, so I remember scanning the dial and seeing what was around. Because I was used to my dad listening to WQAM in South Florida, or 610 WIOD, and listening to their versions of sports talk. So this is what I was used to. I was kind of curious what that was about. But because I'm a teenager, I'm 16 years old in 1995, I'm not thinking about listening to WPTF in the evening for Sportsline. I had no idea it was in existence. So my introduction to a level of sports talk in the area was through 850 The Buzz, Imus in the Morning, and the Fabulous Sports Babe. When 850
Nancy
The Buzz,
Donnellan, yes.
who eventually, when 850 The Buzz went full-time sports in 1998. So when from your perspective, because we hadn't started working together yet. In 1998, when 850 The Buzz turns full-time sports, how did you and WPTF kind of react to an all-time sports station as opposed to just having a sports line 2 hours a day type thing?
Well, this is also one of the points where we were starting to become very much more news-oriented at PTF at that time. So I think that we could see that the handwriting was on the wall, that eventually you were either going to have to go all sports or get out of the sports business entirely. And we did Sportsline up until 99.
Okay.
August of 99 was when we stopped doing that, although our company, which at that point had become Curtis Media Group. Originally it had been Durham Life Broadcasting, but Don Curtis bought it in 1991. Our company continued sports talk on our sister station, which was WDNC.
Yeah, you would do a Saturday morning show.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I remember listening to that.
And there was a weeknight sports talk show on WDNC called Sports Watch that Frank Marock did for a while in there too.
Oh, yes. Okay, now I remember. I was trying to remember who it was. Yes, Frank Maroc.
Who had been at RAL as a TV news director
yes.
at one point. But that continued. But on PTF, we pretty much moved it to political talk at that point.
But I do remember there was some interest because WPTF was still the flagship station for NC State,
right?
And there would be ancillary program pre and post, especially during the football season.
Yeah, I still did for many years a long form post game show after every NC State game, and that continued until when I left PTF full-time in 2004. That's when that show ended, basically.
Okay.
Taylor Zarzer did one on PTF after that, but it wasn't the same format as the one I had done.
Yes. So in 2007, April 2007, Don Imus gets into his very famous controversy with Rutgers women's basketball, and he eventually gets fired. And at that time, I'm at 850. Well, I'm at 850 The Buzz, but I'm also hosting a morning show with Morgan Patrick called The Morning Mojo. But when Imus got fired, it disrupted the format for 850 The Buzz. We didn't have a morning show, and Imus had done very, very well for us in this market. So they decided, in their infinite wisdom, let's do our own version of Imus in the morning. And I believe by that summertime, they had blown up the morning show I was doing with Morgan Patrick, and they brought me back to work with Adam Gold, who had been his producer for a very long time. And you were brought on as our newsreader at that point.
And I actually came in while you late in the days with Morgan.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for reminding me.
Yeah.
I was trying to remember because WDNC, for those who do not know, which is now Buzz Sports Radio, and we have our FM translators and everything else. That's a legacy format.
Right, and at that point, when what was then McClatchy Broadcasting.
Yes, Don Curtis' son-in-law.
Right, Billy McClatchy.
Yes.
Had acquired WDNC, and I was doing the morning show on WDNC at that point after I had retired from PTF the first time. So I was the morning show host, and
so wait, I replaced you?
Yeah,
is that what happened?
But yeah, I remember Billy.
Well, real quick context. So there was to kind of add the context here. Don Curtis, who owns a cluster of radio stations, decided to purchase 850 The Buzz. The problem was that the FCC had rules at the time that limited the amount of radio stations you could own in a particular market. So rather than just give up the sale altogether, he found his way around it by having his son-in-law buy the radio station. So at that point, he had owned 620 WDNC AM and then 102.9, which then got flipped to, I think, Kicks, which there's a deeper conversation about the Kicks call letters.
Which has been all over the place.
All over the place. I mean, Kick 850 The Buzz used to be Kicks 85 back in the day.
And was again briefly after 850.
Yes, it was. I do remember that. So that kids Wikipedia that one, because call letters change all the time and formats flip all the time in radio. It's one of the realities of this business. So I thank you for reminding me, because I had forgotten that in that purchase sequence that we essentially bumped you off your morning show.
Right. And I came over to work with you and when Morgan. In the morning
Okay.
Yeah.
So then that got blown up, and you get paired with me and Adam to do this morning show.
And we do that together for about 4 years.
Actually, it was 2 years. Well, you were doing stuff with DNC with us before that, but the actual iteration of that morning show with me, Adam, and you, special shout out to Terry Tuff for his brief appearance on that show. That lasted 2 years. I actually had to go back and double check on that one because, 2007, Imus gets fired. We flipped the format. We tried to do a hybrid show like Imus until WCMC-FM decides to flip to what is now 99.9 The Fan. It was genuine country at that time. They had taken the ESPN affiliation. They went all sports, signed on in October of 2007, and that's when we got like, oh crap.
Yeah.
Like, we can't mess around. We have to go back to being all sports all the time. And we did that until Don Curtis and Jim Goodman, owner of Capital Broadcasting decided to do what rich people do, and they just decided, hey, you give me these radio stations, I give you this network, and it all comes out in a wash.
Fall of 2009.
In 2009, yes.
Yeah.
So you were with us until 2009. What did you do after that?
Well, after that, I decided that I'm just going to do baseball for a while, and for several years I did that. I embarked on my second career as a baseball PA announcer.
You've been the Durham Bulls PA since what, 2007?
2006, as a matter of fact.
2006, okay.
Because I was doing that when I was doing the show with you and Adam.
That's right.
Too. But and then and I was also doing NC State baseball public address, and then by stroke of luck, the director of the Arizona Fall League, Steve Cobb, I met in spring training, and I was talking to him, what I did. He said, well, we've got some PA jobs out in the Fall League. Do you have any interest in doing that? And I said, yeah. So I was hired by Major League Baseball as one of the 5 PA announcers in the Fall League, and I still do that. And then I got an email one day from the director of sports and tourism for the city of Surprise, Arizona, which is the home of spring training for the Texas Rangers and the Kansas City Royals. And he said, our longtime PA announcer is retiring. Steve Cobb, who was the Fall League director, says, you're our man.
Okay.
Would you be interested? And I said, well, of course. He said, well, we'll fly you out here. Let's come out and talk. And so I've been doing that for 12 years now, too. And that's what I did, and I ran the Raleigh Hot Stove League.
Yes, I remember
doing the annual banquet there for a long time. And then in 2014, I got a call from Brian Freeman, who was then the director of programming, spoken word programming for Curtis Media. And ran WPTF and the North Carolina News Network, which Curtis had acquired from Capitol in 2009.
Yes.
And
part of the trade.
Yeah, exactly, the moving parts. And Freeman says, and a man I'd never met because he hadn't been at PTF when I was there, he said, I want you to come home. And I said, I've got a lot of things that I'd like you to do here. And he said, it will not interfere with your baseball. We'll respect that.
Sure.
Your 3 months a year. And so I went back over there in 2014, and I do a lot of stuff over there, a lot of anchoring on the North Carolina News Network, news and sports, and on PTF. I do the PTF morning show when Scott Brigham's away. And so I keep busy.
So I am curious, when you, as somebody who was doing sports talk before what we consider modern sports talk. I'm gonna put the line of demarcation of modern sports talk to when 850 The Buzz went full time in 1998, and Adam Gold was doing afternoons and Morgan Patrick was doing evenings. Shout out to Mike Solarte, who was doing the sports bar in mid mornings,
who we still see on Spectrum.
We still do. Shout out to Mike, he's a great guy. What did you think of our version of sports talk?
Well, it was very different, and one of the biggest differences was, in a way, it was skewing younger than our version had.
Sure.
Been.
So for us, for quick context here, our key demographic for sports talk is men 25 to 54. Ideally, for me, I like to get even a little bit in the younger demographic. If I can get people who are 18 to 34, I'm very happy because I feel like you've built a habit and they'll grow with you. So you're saying in the 70s and the 80s, it's skewing older than that?
It was skewing older than that. I would say it was skewing in the 30s and the 40s, in the 70s and the 80s and early 90s. I think it was starting to skew a little younger in the early 90s.
If I get a college-age sports fan to say they listen to the show, I'm ecstatic about that, because to me that is fostering a routine and a relationship with the audience that will grow with you over time. I see what you're saying, though. So it was,
and we were a little more. We were more formal at that point too.
Well, Tony, let's be real. Gold does not have a traditional radio voice. I do not have a traditional radio voice. I do not have your voice, okay? So Gold and I are out here screeching on the radio about things, about, I think X, Y, Z. So,
but the other thing, too, is what you added in addition to just sports talk, it became a little bit more young male talk as well as just the sports talk. So that was an evolution of that, too. And
you didn't have Buzz Babes.
No, we did not. We didn't have the calendars. I still have some of the calendars. But
I got Buzz Babe calendars somewhere in the attic. I have no idea where they are. But yeah. But you would never do that. That would be if somebody came to you in the 70s and the 80s and said, "Hey, look, we're going to put out a calendar of young women wearing station paraphernalia." You're thinking, are you nuts? There's no way that's going to happen, right?
No, I would have thought that. And when you mentioned that's the first time I thought about that, about the Buzz Babe calendars in a long time. But I still do have some of those.
Perfect. Yeah, and look, we would not even do that now either.
Right.
Because I do think there's been an evolution from where we were in the early 2000s. I think I think there's been a turn back to, I don't want to call it more formal, but I do think that we've gotten smarter in how we have conversations about things.
Well, serious is not the right word, but it's what I'm going to say. When I listen to you and Joe, it's more serious than it would have been a decade and a half ago.
Easily. Yeah, absolutely. And some of that, too, is me.
Right.
When when you had come over so that had to be 2005, 2006.
I think it was 2005.
2005 when we started doing that.
We were still on Falls of the News.
I was 26 years old.
Yeah.
I'm still a baby in the grand scheme of things. So yeah, it's going to be a little bit more irreverent behavior when you're in your 20s as opposed to now where I'm old and I got 2 kids and I've seen a bunch of stuff. So I think that's just one of those things that ultimately comes with age.
But I got to say that when I came over and working with you and Morgan and then you and Adam, I was wondering, well, how am I going to like this? But I ended up loving it because you guys were so great to me my entire time here.
Good. You're a fixture at Bulls games. I know my dad always makes a point.
He comes by every time.
Every time he goes to a Bulls game,
with his Cardinals jersey on.
Yeah, I know. He's always in his uniform for a baseball game, and he always goes and says, "Hey, do you?" And actually, that's where I wanted to close the conversation. I wanted to tie it back to baseball because, again, you've always been a baseball guy. Yeah. When you grow up on Tobacco Road. I can't find anybody more Durham than you, all things considered, and yet. You've always had that love of baseball, and you were going to Bulls games. You're going to Bulls games in the 60s, right?
Yeah,
you're watching Joe Morgan.
Yeah, and I was watching actually the year before Joe Morgan, 1962, when I was 9 years old. Mm-hmm. Was my first year of my father having some season tickets to the Bulls. And Rusty Staub, later at La Grande Orange with the Montreal Expos, was the first baseman for the Bulls, and that was a great team. And so I got hooked on it then, and then Joe Morgan was in the next year. Mm-hmm. We were Houston. They weren't even the Astros then. They were the Houston Colt 45s.
Oh, right, okay.
And I got hooked on that and just started watching baseball constantly on TV and buying all the baseball books. And there was an old slogan baseball had in the 70s and 80s called baseball fever. Catch it lasts forever. With me, it has.
I actually have a Durham Bulls shirt. It's a faux vintage shirt that actually says, Durham Bulls baseball catch. Right. It's a fever. It's that exact logo. So you're at the old Durham Athletic Park watching these games. So for you, like, when did you realize, wait a minute, like, I might actually be able to live out a dream here? You're going to Durham Bulls baseball games as a kid. You cover them.
Yes.
And then Bulls were gone for what, 8 years?
They were gone from 72 through 79, came back in 1980.
And you get to do play-by-play?
I got to do play-by-play on some games. I was never the regular play-by-play guy. Miles Wolff was the initial owner of the Bulls.
Okay.
And I had talked to Miles after Dave Slade was the first Bulls play-by-play man when they came back, and he did it in 1980, and then Steve Lamar did the Bulls in 81. He went to the New York Mets after that. So they were looking for a play-by-play guy for the 1982 season, and I talked seriously with Miles Wolff about it, but at that point, I simply couldn't afford to do it.
Okay.
Because I was working at PTF, and Durham Life Broadcasting owned them at that time. And, not getting rich, but they paid well.
Yeah, I was going to say, it was a different time.
Yeah. And I couldn't afford to go into just a per-game thing. And
how much were they paying per game?
They were paying $37 a game at that point. Why 37? I don't know.
30,
but
that's
I
a very
do remember
specific
it.
number.
Yeah.
That's a very specific number. Although if you talk to some freelance play-by-play people these days, $37 actually is not that bad. Adjust that for inflation, right? So it's $37 per game.
Per game, yeah.
Okay.
And so they ended up hiring a guy named Steve Pratt who came in and did it for several years.
Okay.
And then after that, there'd been a succession. But the nice thing for me was that beginning in 1984, the Bulls and PTF came to an agreement that they wanted to get some 50,000-watt games, too.
Okay.
And so all the Bulls' Saturday night home games were on PTF as well, and I did the broadcast on PTF.
Okay.
And at that point, Durham Cablevision had started televising around 15 to 20 Bulls games a year.
This is the proto days of cable.
Right,
Okay.
exactly. And I did the play-by-play for those games for several years until Durham Cablevision basically ceased to exist because they were acquired by a succession of companies over the years.
So for somebody who goes to a Bulls game now, AAA affiliate, the DBAP is one of the nicer parks in the country for a minor league baseball team. And there's, you've got the Blue Monster with the screen. You've got, obviously you're doing play-by-play. You've got in-game entertainment with Jatovie McDuffie. It's an experience now.
Right.
What was minor league baseball during? And we're gonna go ahead and use the '80s as a line of demarcation here because I feel like that's the Durham Bulls that people know.
Yeah.
Not the previous iterations that you grew up watching, but for the modern era of the Durham Bulls, '80s, that's the one we know. So what was going to a game like back then?
Well, it had started some evolution in the 60s. It had been simply baseball. That was it.
Okay.
Starting in the 80s, there was a little bit of entertainment aspects to it. There'd be some games on the field occasionally. The pitch through the board game.
Okay.
Which there's a name for it, but it's escaping me right now.
Yeah, and I know what you mean.
And you would, and maybe a race or two, but it didn't go big time with that as long as we were in the old ballpark. Really, you couldn't do fireworks over there because there were oil storage tanks across the street, and so fire marshal would not allow fireworks from the old ballpark. So it wasn't until the new ballpark opened in '95.
Mike Burling wouldn't know what to do with the fireworks night. Come on now,
Mike would not like that.
No. I get my fireworks. Was the press box outside?
Press box was down low directly behind home plate. It was a bunker, and it's still there if you walk over to the old ballpark.
Yeah.
The thing you saw in the movie was made just for the movie.
Okay, now that's what I wanted to ask you. So you're there. You're part of the Bulls during the era in which the movie romanticized.
Right.
So what did Bull Durham get right about that time? And what did they get wrong about that time?
Well, what they got right about it, I think, was the passion that a lot of fans had for the Bulls. What they got right was the struggle of players and the occasional veteran. Although
because you're getting paid $37.
Yeah.
Theoretically, you're getting paid $37 to do play-by-play. What are the players making?
Not a whole lot.
Not a whole lot, right?
And this was a point, too, where unlike in the movie, it would have been extremely unusual for a player with the amount of experience that Crash Davis had to go down to Class A ball. But it was great for the story. But you did see the struggle there. What they got wrong, well, it was numerous things they got wrong. One thing, It was bizarre. You would, if you watched that movie, you'd see them playing the Eugene Emeralds, who were in the Northwest League out in Eugene, Oregon.
Okay. Only you would know that.
Things like that.
Only you would know that.
The press box was constructed hanging from the rafters there.
Okay.
The rafters there could not support a working press box.
Gotcha.
That's one reason it was down low to
Gotcha.
begin with. And I guess the thing about the movie that I disliked the most was the fact that they had the guy that they had doing radio was a hayseed.
Mm-hmm.
And Durham Bulls radio was never like that.
No.
No. So, because if you know Miles Wolff, that's the last thing he would ever have.
They also didn't they get the radio station wrong too?
Yes, they did.
It was, I think at the time it was G105 that they had the call letters for, right?
Right, yeah, which was not a station that
existed at that point.
Yeah, well, they existed, but they were not the Bulls' flagship.
It was WDNC, right?
Exactly.
Okay, because that, for me, as somebody who worked on WDNC, and I have this sign in my cubicle from that era, that actually is one thing that has always bothered me. Like, wait a minute, that wasn't the radio
and
station.
I think they had WRDU doing the games, and WRDU existed, but it was never a sports station.
No, not in the 80s.
Yeah.
No, not in the 80s. Okay, that's interesting. That's interesting. So for somebody who's been a baseball lifer, there's always this conversation about bringing Major League Baseball to this market. I know there was a brief moment in time where the Twins could have possibly moved to Greensboro to split the difference between Charlotte and Raleigh, and that made a lot of sense during that era of getting away from downtown parks and everything else. But do you think now, with the growth of the area, and as more and more corporations have kind of settled in here, and you've seen the success with the Carolina Hurricanes, do you think we could sustain a Major League Baseball team?
It's an interesting question. I think it would be difficult.
Okay.
I think you could do fine on the weekends.
Okay.
Because on the weekends you would have people coming in from surrounding areas.
Makes sense, yeah.
I think it would be difficult to sustain Major League Baseball on a Monday through Thursday basis, simply because even though we've grown so much, we don't have the population base that a lot of the big league cities do, and a lot of them struggle Monday. Look at Tampa.
I look at it.
Yeah,
I think the way it's always been explained to me is that Milwaukee is the comparable to this area now, and nobody would ever think twice about the Brewers not being in Milwaukee. So if you're looking at population density, why wouldn't it? But I guess unlike Milwaukee, there is no real. We're too spread out still.
Now we are an area, not one city.
Yes.
And that makes a difference. The other factor that comes into play, too, I think it would be very, very difficult now to ever get Major League Baseball to approve, because we are too close to Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
Once the Nationals came in, we're less than 5 hours from the Nationals. People talk about this area, and if you're from outside this area, you think the Braves, but we're a long ways from the Braves. We're closer to both Baltimore and Washington than we are to the Braves.
True, but when the Braves won the World Series here recently, for me, I understood why it played with the audience, because if you look at the older part of our demographic, if they're going to watch baseball, they got it through the superstations.
WTBS.
This about my dad being the Cardinals fan in South Florida, the way that he was able to keep up with the Cardinals pre-Major League Baseball extra innings package, which did not exist back then, was that the South Florida cable systems got the superstations. We got TBS. We got WGN. We got WOR. So he could watch those away games. When they would play the Mets or the Cubs or
and that's how the Braves got fans all over the country.
Here, because of TBS.
Other factor too with this Braves World Championship was there was the Durham connection, because Durham had been a Braves farm club for so many years.
It's the Chipper Jones connection.
The Chipper Jones, and
also.
The fact that Brian Snitker had managed the Bulls for 3 years too before managing the Braves this year. So there definitely is a connection there.
So do you remember Chipper Jones?
I remember Chipper Jones. As a matter of fact, I emceed his induction into the International League Hall of Fame at the ballpark a few years ago. And I remember Brian Snitker as a player with the Bulls, actually, even in 1980 before he managed. There were a lot of great players who came through Durham with the Braves, although the Braves were never able to give us. They gave us great players, but not good teams.
Interesting.
You're never able to get any championships, whereas with Tampa Bay, it's been one championship after another.
It has. It has.
And we've seen Tampa Bay is a prototype of how to build a team through your farm system and the success that they've had. They're certainly not the prototype for how to get fans to the ballpark.
No. But, there's two different things there. But like, for the Durham Bulls this year, I mean, I remember at the beginning of the season asking Mike Burling, who's the vice president of baseball operations, who's not going to be here? And of course, he points to that guy Wander Franco. He's not going to be here for very long. So enjoy him while you can. But to your point, if you're a baseball fan, the Bulls do offer, because of the relationship with the Rays, an opportunity to see these people before they actually become Major League Baseball
The thing,
stars.
too, with AAA, the way baseball has evolved, the player that's playing for Durham today will be playing for Tampa Bay tomorrow, and the guy that's playing for Tampa Bay today will be playing for Durham tomorrow. There's so much movement back and forth, not just Durham and Tampa Bay, but all over baseball. AAA has become, in some senses, almost a taxi squad for the major league players because there's so much movement back and forth.
Yeah, we've come a long way from, say, the Carolina Mudcats having Miguel Cabrera there for like a hot minute, right? When they were, and they were Class A at that point, or a high Class A with the Marlins at that point.
Yeah, the Mudcats have been they were originally Double A, and then they were high Class A. Now they're Low A after the movement there with the Brewers.
Now the Brewers now own them. Yes, I think Steve Bryant got out of the business.
Right, and Joe Kramer's now retired, so it's sort of a different group there now.
Okay. Well, Tony, I enjoyed our trip down memory lane.
Well, thank you, Joe. And
So
we get together in the studio, every 14 years?
I think that's like where we are right now. I was going to say, that's actually where we're close this. You having done this for as long as you've done this, for 50 years, for the purposes of this conversation, we'll use 10 instead of 14. AM stations might not exist in 10 years.
Who knows? Yeah.
Okay. And I don't pretend to know what's going to happen with the FM signal in the next 10 years.
There are a lot of people who don't think terrestrial radio will last. I think it will, but a lot of people don't think it will.
Oh, I think it will because it's easy to it doesn't cost data.
Yeah.
It's easy to access because all you need is an antenna and whatnot. I mean, I know what the stats are. The majority of people still get their music and things like that from FM as opposed to streaming services. But yeah, who's to say what happens in the next 10 years?
Of course, the thing too, though, Joe, people have been predicting the death of radio since the beginning of television, and that's been 80 years now.